computer. So let me tell you a little bit about myself. For those of you who do not know me or are not familiar with Marine Resources Council, my name is Caity, and I've been at Marine Resources Council for 3 years now. Prior to Marine Resources Council, I was at the University of Miami, where I went to grad school. I got a degree in marine conservation and kind of a minor in geographic information systems, which is basically making maps. Prior to that, I was at the University of Florida, where I got a bachelor's degree in psychology. So I have a really interesting, diverse background, which makes me, I guess, perfect to work at MRC because we really move in a million different directions. We're a nonprofit that's dedicated to the lagoon through education, science, and restoration. So I've been working on science and restoration projects, and living shorelines is really the area of my focus that I've enjoyed the most learning about and really getting hands-on and dirty and getting out in the environment and really learning as much as I can from restoration professionals that have been doing this for way longer than me. And after 3 years, you know, I'm excited to present to you guys about everything I've learned. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen with my PowerPoint. Share. Oh, and I'm going to turn off my video because I find it a little distracting. Hopefully you guys are okay with that. How do I do that? Stop video. Okay, so now we just have my PowerPoint. So last month, we have these brown bags every month. And last month we had Laura Lee Thompson, who did such a great job. She grew up on the lagoon and in a different era. And she really painted this fairy tale picture of how the lagoon used to be just thriving and teeming with life. And I really kind of wanted to pick up where she left off. And if you haven't seen that presentation, I would really recommend going back and watching it. I believe it's on our Facebook page and you can find it. Really worth a watch. She did such a great job. And I mean, I just think it's so important to recognize how far we've fallen from, you know, you hear people like Laura Lee and people that grew up here in the 50s and 60s, and just, you know, it's so horrible and so sad to see how far we've come. And so I think it's really important, you know, to recognize that and to keep it kind of at the forefront of our minds of what we're working towards and why we need to question our status quos and why we need to question our development methods. As we've developed, we've really compromised the health of our backyard playground. And I really hope that my kid, you know, eventually, and all of our kids and future generations can enjoy playing in the water like Laura Lee did as a child. So I think it's all of our responsibilities to kind of question our status quos that we might be maintaining to maybe kind of hopefully reverse some of the damage that we've done. So first, I want to make sure everyone understands that shorelines are dynamic. What I mean by that is that naturally they should be able to alter and shift and move. They're kind of like this semi-fluid environment. And we've done something very unnatural by basically bordering them in. You know, barrier islands are not meant to stay still. We've cemented them in and we spend billions of dollars renourishing beaches with trucked in sand. They're really not meant to be linear, and we've boxed them in through shoreline hardening. This is something important for everyone to understand, that shoreline hardening is basically the opposite of living shorelines. So I wanted to start here and just you know, talk a little bit about shoreline hardening, also called shoreline armoring. In Brevard County, 60% or more than 60% of our shorelines are hardened. And this is typical of many counties in Florida. Many of these seawalls were put in during our development boom, and now they're nearing the end of their lives. They don't last forever. And they're in need of either replacement or repair, both of which are very expensive. These seawalls are constantly battling this dynamic shifting of the land-sea interface. This is a really good visual I'm going to play for you guys. Hopefully you can hear it. Again, don't refrain from commenting if it doesn't work. I have somebody that's going to text me. So
under normal day-to-day conditions, water interacting with a bulkhead or a revetment or a seawall, waves approaching that structure will almost be fully reflected and go back offshore. That process of hitting the structure and then reflecting causes very chaotic velocities right in front of the structure. And a lot of times what that will do is take a material of sediment at the bottom of the structure and scoop it out and take it somewhere else. So already you're increasing your risk of failure by putting that bulkhead in there.
So seawalls basically create like these dead zones where wave energy isn't absorbed naturally like it would be. This dynamic not only is undercutting and undermining these structures, but they're also contributing to reductions in water quality and habitat. So these are examples of what a natural shoreline would look like, with a sloping interface, full of plants that absorb nutrients and life that supports recreation and commerce, like fish and birds and little benthic critters like crabs. And when we harden the majority of our shorelines, all of that benthic habitat and all that life that it supports goes away. And, you know, for those of us that like fishing, either recreationally or commercially, you know, fish depend on this intertidal habitat, this near shore habitat, for nurseries. So when you take away nurseries and babies can't grow up, you know, what happens? The biggest kicker, you know, about seawalls is that they often don't even accomplish their main purpose of erosion control. They actually have been shown to do the opposite and actually increase erosion issues. So now that we've installed all this structure and we've learned that they cause more problems than they're worth in a lot of cases, what are our options moving forward? Basically, I see two options for property owners with seawalls: redemption, which I'll talk about in a minute, and conversion. The first one, redemption, is for people who have structurally sound, relatively new seawalls that are not willing to convert them. The second option, conversion, would be best suited for someone who's facing the reality of an expensive replacement or repair costs. As you can see in these pictures, you know, this is really typical of seawalls. Whenever they start repairing, or whenever they start, you know, degrading like this, you're looking at a hefty bill to repair it. So if you have a seawall and it's relatively new or structurally sound, obviously you're not going to demo it. I get that. Or maybe you will, and if you want to, talk to me. You can, though, if you want to keep that seawall, of course. There are some options depending on the site. You can do some things to help reverse the damage in terms of habitat reduction. Some of the options need permits. Pretty much anything that goes in the water, like a reef ball. So the picture here on the left is kind of like an educational purpose reef ball. Obviously it's not in the water, it's just to show you what they look like. They have these really cool holes for fish and stuff to seek refuge, and then a big hole at the top that you can put a mangrove in if the water depth allows it. And then this is a picture in Cedar Key where they recently deployed all these reef balls. So just really cool, because these are protecting this shoreline from wave and wind energy, and it's also really enhancing the habitat availability there. So reef balls are really cool. That's something that you might be able to put depending on permitting and depending on navigation. Like if you're in a really tight canal, these might not work, but if you have some space to play with and we can get them permitted, reef balls can be a really great option that both help with that wave problem that I showed you, that diagram where the waves were just reflecting and scouring. If you put anything at the base of your seawall, it's really going to help that issue, and it's probably, not only is it going to improve habitat and water quality, but it's also going to, you know, make the life of your seawall last longer. So reef balls are really cool. They also, you know, they provide habitat for shellfish. You'll probably see oysters growing on them. And then there's this other cool option called living seawalls. There is a similar program in our area from FIT. They do a living docks. I'm not sure if they're actively recruiting for that, but you can reach out to FIT if you want to do a living dock. Those are really cool and very similar to this, which is being utilized in Australia. I think it'd be pretty cool to start making them here. Basically the little crevices in between and in the little shapes allow for critter habitat. And then above seawalls, there's also options like Florida-friendly landscaping. This will help with water quality issues, you know, creating this buffer that's really like super close to that water where you don't have to fertilize or irrigate is really helpful to improve water quality. There's more information about this. Keep Brevard Beautiful is a really great source. If you're interested in converting to Florida-friendly landscaping techniques, this is a really great option. So the number 2 option for people with seawalls, especially if they're failing, is conversion. I see so many failing seawalls. If you get in a boat and drive up and down canals, pretty much anywhere in Florida, you see seawalls falling, sumping, cracking, all kinds of you know, degradation happening. And at some point, these people are going to be faced with them, you know, collapsing either beyond the point of repairing it, where they're just gonna have to replace it. So why not investigate if a more resilient and affordable option is possible? I will disclaim by saying that, you know, it's not always possible to invest in a living shoreline. There certainly are shorelines where you have to have a seawall, but I think that it's worth an investigation if you're at this point where you need to decide whether you repair it or replace it or maybe convert it. I wanted to show you a quick video of a conversion in the Tampa area. So this was in Safety Harbor.
Different waterfront. Instead of your traditional seawall, you'll find this at Safety Harbor Waterfront Park.
Yeah, it's really cool. ABC Action News reporter Lauren St. Germain is there with the benefits of this so-called living shoreline. These kids planting are part of a group building a living shoreline more than 200 feet long, all to replace this older, crumbling seawall.
It's better for the environment, cleaner for the water, better for the fish and birds, and you don't have to replace it.
Tom Reese with Environmental Science Associate of Safety Harbor to get this project done. He says the seawall disrupted a natural process.
By putting the rocks in, oysters coming back, and then we'll have fish, and that brings birds. And so dynamic and vibrant living community right here.
Brian Flynn, a coastal engineer, explains more benefits.
As sea level rise and we have storm surge and things like that, this shoreline
it's going to grow. It's going to get bigger.
Research shows these shorelines are more resilient in storms. This type of shoreline will also break up wave energy.
This is obviously more natural. It's on a slope, where the seawall is just vertical.
Check this out. After a volunteer build, you see right here, they're almost done. Just need to add a little more marsh grass and hope it will become an example for other Bay Area cities to follow. In Safety Harbor, Lauren St. Germain, ABC Action News.
The mayor of Safety Harbor.
Let me turn that off. Sorry it didn't play. I thought that it would. But I think that you got the audio. And if you want to watch the video, it is a really cool video. You just need to Google Seawall, Living Shoreline, Safety Harbor. It'll probably be the top thing. So what you couldn't see is that they created a revetment, which is actually my next slide. So no big deal. They created a revetment, which is not technically a living shoreline, but it is a big improvement from a vertical seawall. So this picture is actually a community here in Brevard County that recently contracted MRC for me to help them through the design and permitting phase of converting this revetment to a greener, softer approach of a breakwater and wetland. So what we're gonna do is this revetment, which is these rocks, it actually has a little wooden seawall right here, if you can see that. These rocks are gonna be pushed out to create a breakwater. So the rocks will wind up probably about here with some gaps in between. And I'm gonna show you more pictures in the next few slides of another breakwater, so you'll get a visual. But this is a really neat, it's a cool, you know, example of a community that is embracing this kind of conversion technique where they've seen some erosion issues. They've seen some sumping back here. So the land behind the seawall is doing what it wants to do naturally, which is have like this natural slope where you know, the land to sea interface is a natural slope and it's gradiated, and so they're having erosion issues and they're disappointed because they just invested in all these rocks, but we're going to reuse them. So that's a really fun, exciting project for me, and I'm hoping that I get more of these because we have a lot of these revetments in the community, and they can really be improved to both increase protection of the homeowners and also increase water quality and habitat. So this diagram comes from NOAA's website, and it kind of shows you all, well, most of the options. One thing I wanted to mention is that there is another option that's really cool called terracing that you can do, and that's really good for like really steep slopes. You can use terracing. And one of the really interesting and fun things for me about living shorelines is that you can kind of combine all of these methods. So you have bulkheads and seawalls over here, which are your hardest or grayest, you know, engineered structures, followed by revetments, which we just saw, and then followed by breakwaters. And in my opinion, whenever you combine vegetation and breakwaters, you know, it kind of creates the breakwater as like a much greener or softer approach, because you actually expand the wetland, which we've seen, and I'm going to show you pictures of. So this is kind of like a gradient just of, you know, living to more hard armored shorelines. Lots of options, lots of room for creativity to combine these techniques depending on the site. So living shorelines are becoming recognized nationally and at the state and local level as a really great low impact development method. This slide was borrowed directly from FWC, which is a state agency that recently organized a collaborative effort between all these partners to put together an educational workshop targeting marine contractors. So the people that would traditionally install seawalls, the state is trying to teach them about these living shoreline methods and why they're beneficial and how to implement them and how to get through permitting and all the stuff that goes into you know, determining if a site is conducive for a living shoreline. That's a big part of it. So to me, this workshop is a really great sign that we're at the forefront of a movement away from an inefficient development method in favor of a more natural and beneficial approach that can help reverse some of the damage we've done, which I kind of find ironic that, you know, it's a new, quote unquote, new method, but it's really kind of a reversion back to what is natural. So far I've talked about hardened shorelines. Since they make up the majority of our shorelines, I think it's really important to talk about what the options are to help improve their negative impacts on water quality and habitat. I have people that you know, will email me or express interest in living shorelines, but as soon as I see pictures of their shoreline and it's a seawall or a revetment, you know, it's a whole other ballgame. It's really difficult to kind of revert that, but like I just showed you, there are options for that land property shoreline type, but there are shorelines that are still available that are natural. Not many, like I said before, more than 60% in Brevard County, it's really typical, are hardened already. So I think it's really important to focus on that 30+% that's still natural to really enhance, you know, really protect those natural shorelines. So typically living shoreline restorations projects happen here on these natural shorelines. They're much easier to work with, obviously, because they're still natural. They still have that natural slope. Much less work to actually to do the projects because you don't have to take something down before you know, recreate. So the goal of these restoration projects is to enhance the important functions that shorelines are naturally designed to provide. By functions, I mean resiliency, adaptability to sea level rise and to storm surge, nutrient reduction, wildlife habitat, and erosion control. At MRC, I've had the privilege of having a large shoreline at our Lagoon House headquarters. It's kind of my backyard playground where I get to go play on the shoreline and experiment, and I've learned so much, and I've really enjoyed watching things transform over the last few years. The first transformation was when we removed in 2018 about a dozen really large Australian pines, which you can see over here. You can see the result in this before and after, which the shade provided by the pines was removed and allowed all this grassy wetland habitat to develop. Australian pines are really nice when we're recreating for the shade, but they are a hazard for infrastructure because they're very superficially rooted, so they topple easily in storms. Not to mention they also shade out the natural vegetation like you see here, which was able to grow and is actually superior for erosion control. Another transformation started with a locally funded Save Our Indian River Lagoon, Brevard County living shoreline planting. So for those of you not in the area or not familiar, Brevard County citizens in 2016 decided to tax ourselves because we recognize that the lagoon is in critical condition, and we decided we could afford a 50-cent sales tax to provide funding to attempt to restore the lagoon. So it's a really awesome plan, and it's pretty much its main goal is to reduce and remove nutrients, because our lagoon, as well as estuaries all over the world, are suffering from what's called eutrophication, which is a fancy word for too many nutrients. So this plan invests in a lot of huge variety of projects, all with the goal of reducing or removing nutrients. So this project in particular, the county estimates that it removes about 101 pounds of total nitrogen per year and 35 pounds of total phosphorus per year. This project was the same year, same type of planting. You can see that these, it's less linear feet, so less nutrient removal, but this is at the Cocoa Beach Golf Course, where they put in a buried seawall that prior to Irma, you could not see it at all. It was completely buried. So after Irma, all this land eroded away, and now you can see this seawall here. I think it was a $2 or $3 million seawall that they invested in. And Irma came in and just really did some damage. This photo I really love because you can see kind of how the mangroves and the rocks kind of held each other together. Everywhere around, Irma kind of scattered the rocks out, but where the mangroves and the rocks were able to hold on to each other, they really did a good job of kind of holding down the land. So UCF was responsible for doing the monitoring for these two plantings. They found that after a year, the success rates for mangroves were 46% at the Lagoon House and 64% at Cocoa Beach. These numbers are not surprising. They might seem a little low, but I was actually quite happy with them. It's pretty difficult to get plants to survive. Anyone that's done a garden understands that. And there's some natural mortality that's expected. And in addition to natural mortality, there's all these factors at a site that really can influence survival and living shoreline success. So you have wind patterns and fetch. Fetch is the distance that wind travels across the lagoon. So the greater the distance, probably the more turbulent that landing spot or that shoreline is going to be. Currents and tidal flux, bathymetry is going to have an effect. Natural slope or artificial. If there's an artificial seawall, it's going to be really difficult to get mangroves to establish there. And then existing structures like docks, what's at the site, what's at your neighbor's site, because what's on your neighbor's shoreline really, can impact your shoreline. People tell me all the time, I had this shoreline, and as soon as my neighbor put in a seawall or did this to their shoreline, my shoreline started eroding. Sand moves, and it's a very fluid environment. So, it's really complex. If I had $1 million, I'd love to pay somebody to create a computer model that basically predicted, where we should be focusing our living shoreline efforts based on all these factors. So at the Lagoon House, at our MRC office, we have a relatively high amount of wind and fetch. So plants, when we did that planting I just showed you a picture of, they had a hard time establishing. I witnessed a lot of plants washing out right after the planting. So I got the go-ahead to design a breakwater. I kind of was like, oh no, I wanted to protect my mangrove babies. I saw them washing out. So I was like, what do I do? So I worked with restoration engineers, went through the permitting process for 11 sections of breakwater, permitted to span almost the entire Lagoon House shoreline. Thanks to the Tourism Development Council, we received funding to build our first 4 sections, which were built in early June of 2019. I think that this was like a snapshot or a story or something of mine, because I was just so excited to see construction actually happening between the permitting and the design and the grant writing to secure the funds. It felt like such a process, and it was so rewarding to see it finally go in. And it's been even more amazing to watch it grow and change. It's been amazing to watch how the shoreline's been altered, and I have no doubts that the breakwater is protecting and maximizing those nutrient reduction numbers that the county is after for protecting and restoring the lagoon. I do have to give a special thank you to a dedicated volunteer who's been coming every single month since this breakwater was installed, to take drone pictures so we can see how the shoreline's changing. But before I move on to the next slide, please take a look at the setback line of the vegetation. So this was right after it was installed, so not much changes yet. And you can see the setback line is pretty far back, a few feet from the rocks. Fast forward a year later, June of 2020, you can see clear evidence of wetland expansion, where the marsh grass has been able to grow right up to the rocks. This is a perfect case study of how living shoreline stabilization can not only help with erosion issues, but may even provide the opposite effect of building up more land, which is called accretion. So we've seen this wetland completely expand behind the rocks. Another good comparison is before and after Hurricane Dorian, which, knock on wood, is the only test we've had so far since these rocks were put out. This picture was taken just before the storm. You can see some water pooling behind the rocks here, and you can see that the grasses are like full on, growing out and almost into the rocks here. And I like to call this a breakwater and also a living reef. We call it that kind of interchangeably because it has for sure increased wildlife habitat. I see fish, little fish pooling and seeking refuge in the rocks, and wading birds and all kinds of crabs and benthic stuff all over the rocks. We've seen oysters growing on them. So it has kind of become, a reef in our minds. So it's been really cool to watch. So anyways, this was pre-Dorian. After Dorian, I was so excited that all the mangroves behind the rocks that we had just planted, we had just put these in maybe a month or so before, and all of them were still standing. And I put this in here and it won't play. I was really disappointed. It's baby Groot, and he's supposed to dance, a little happy dance for all of our mangroves. So I will say there's like a 5 to 10 minute walk from the access point on our shoreline down to these breakwater structures. And in that walk, when I walked out the next morning for post-Dorian, there were mangroves that did not make it along the shoreline, not where the breakwater was. But then behind the breakwater, the plants were secure. So for me, that was like a huge win, very satisfying to see that I felt like the breakwater really performed really well in that test. So here's a recent top down of all 4 structures. By the way, we have 4 structures built. We have 11 permitted. So I would, the end goal is to create more of these. The design and, might change a little bit because we might learn some things from these 4 and we might want to make some changes. So, exciting because in the future, we could be experimenting with more sections of these, but so each section is, so there's 4 of them here. Each one is 50 feet long, 8 feet wide, with 10-foot gaps. And in permitting, they require 5 feet in between. Another thing that we might play with, because as you can see, there is scalloping in between these breakwater structures. One thing that's been really interesting to watch, I suspect it's seasonal, is that sometimes these actually mound. My mouse keeps disappearing. Sometimes this section in between actually mounds over where there's like a mound of sand, and then sometimes it erodes and scallops in between. So again, really complex factors that affect that, probably tides and winds and sand deposition and how sand moves down the shoreline, but just really interesting to watch. And I did do 10-foot gaps instead of 5-foot gaps as required by the state. It's a requirement for manatees and wildlife in general. I think our application is more for horseshoe crabs. So I've noticed a lot of horseshoe crabs nesting on our beaches. So I wanted to make sure they had plenty of room to climb up and do what they do on the beach. So sometimes breakwaters are not breaking the surface, they're just below the surface in the form of an oyster reef. In our area and in most of Florida, living shorelines typically include the use of plants like mangroves and grasses and oyster bags. Recently, the state has become concerned with traditional oyster restoration methods due to its dependence on plastic bags, which could be contributing to our microplastics issue in the marine environment. There's been a huge push to test alternative materials, but the problem is getting the material to last long enough for the reef to build, which can take several years. For instance, I put out some cellulose bags that are made of like a natural fiber that looked, you know, they were the same shape as traditional oyster bags, but they were just made of like a natural fiber. We put them out and they literally lasted only 17 days before disintegrating. And that is not nearly long enough for any kind of reef habitat to have formed. So another alternative that's being tested right now are called core modules. They're these little concrete bricks that they put oyster shells dried into the concrete and they stick up. They've worked really well in areas like St. Augustine, where they were developed by the University of Florida. I believe they're still being tested by Brevard County. I suspect, this is just my opinion, that they're not a really good option for our area just because of their efficiency, and the limitations we have in our system don't allow for this small amount of shell to you know, kind of grow what we need to grow. You know, one traditional oyster bag probably covers the same surface area of like 2 or 3 of these structures, and it's like probably not even like 1/10 of the amount of shell that a normal bag holds. So from an efficiency standpoint, I just don't know if these are really good for our system. But in my opinion, the method that shows some promise in changing the status quo in oyster restoration is called oyster prisms, which are these. These were developed by University of Florida also, and they're currently being tested in Cedar Key. So far, they've put these out and they've been in the water for 2 years and they're still holding up. So that's a really good sign. And you know, as far as efficiency, they're also, I think, really practical because one of these actually holds 3 traditional oyster bags worth of shell volume. So I'm hoping to test these at our Lagoon House shoreline soon. So maybe in a few years, we'll know whether these are, you know, an effective and productive method for oyster restoration here. So MRC typically mostly dabbles in the mangrove and vegetation side of living shorelines. This is a picture of our mangrove nursery a few years ago. We care for all 3 species, red, blacks, and whites. These plants are all intended for restoration projects to protect our community shorelines. They've gone to private homeowners, county projects, state projects, kind of anybody who's interested in mangroves. We've got plenty, and we've got every stage of growth pretty much. You can see these giant ones grown up into the rafters, and we also have little seedlings. And we really can't do this. We can't care for this many plants without the help of our public, our community. So a really great way to get involved in our living shoreline projects is to actually collect propagules and seedlings. When you're on the beach, you can bring a bag, 1 bag for trash, 1 bag for seeds and beach comb, and bring us the seeds to the Lagoon House, and we'll take care of them for a couple years, probably 3 or 4 years before they're used out on restoration projects. and so there's 3 species, like I was saying. So these are reds. You see these a lot. These are pretty common. Blacks and whites only drop in the fall. And one thing I will say is, please do not pull these from the trees. We do like to solicit the public in this, but I always am careful to make sure to tell people that mangroves are protected species. So don't pull them, both because it could be considered illegal, but also because if the seeds haven't dropped naturally themselves already, then they're probably not ready to drop. So just let them do their thing. Rescue them from the beach. That's the best place to pick them up, because if they're washed up on the Atlantic beach, there's no way they're going to grow in that really high energy, turbulent beachfront area. Mangroves don't grow there. They grow more in like backwater estuaries where it's more protected. So if you pick them up from the beach, you're rescuing them. So don't pull them from the trees, rescue them from the beach. So a couple examples of recent projects. Brevard County Mosquito Control District contacted me. They said that they had some pockets of a mosquito impoundment dike that were eroding. So they wanted to put some mangroves in there to stabilize it. So they reached out and we got some mangroves out to them. They put this core fiber log, which is really cool, to kind of improve their, hopefully their success rates to get these plants to establish. You know, during that critical time I was telling you about, you know, as soon as you plant them, they're kind of really vulnerable. So you want to get them, if you can improve their likelihood of success by protecting them with a breakwater or something like this, it will really do the plants some good. So also recent projects was only a few weeks ago, we did more of the SOIRL planting. So these again were funded by the Save Our Indian River Lagoon project plan, that half-cent sales tax going to good work. We were able to plant 60 red mangroves and 200 Spartina plugs at both Fisherman's Landing and at Suntree Rotary Park. Both of them Brevard County Parks and Rec projects. Parks and Rec actually reached out to me and said these shorelines really could probably use some enhancement. So what can we do? I owe a huge thank you to these volunteers. I always owe a huge thank you to our volunteers. We really couldn't do nearly as much as we do without them, but especially during this really strange, awkward social times, it means a lot that these people were dedicated enough to come out and kind of brave the social distancing planting. We were able to maintain social distance for the most part, and it was a really great time. So I also feel obligated to point out that living shorelines also have really great implications for our future in terms of carbon sequestration. We are producing carbon at a very unsustainable rate, and mangroves exist in a really large, significant area of the world. So from a global perspective, mangroves and restoring marine ecosystems in general is a really great way to focus our efforts because they're highly efficient. Marine ecosystems, you know, there's some literature that says that they're 10 times more efficient than land systems at sequestering carbon. So I think that it's a really great way to focus our energies to kind of maybe restore some balance. So in closing, I wanted to kind of reiterate main points. I've touched on most of these throughout the presentation, but I wanted one closing slide to just succinctly, you know, point out the benefits of living shorelines. So to reiterate, the living shorelines definition is basically the use of natural materials like oysters, rocks, and vegetation to enhance natural shoreline functions. And this has many benefits, the top one being erosion control, and with that, resiliency and adaptability. Climate change is happening, sea level is, you know, rising, and these, if we can enhance our shoreline's natural ability to adapt, rather than, you know, hardening them and kind of increasing erosion issues. And then with that, we can also improve habitat and water quality and reduce nutrients, efficient carbon sinks. And then a big one for me is the beautification. I think that it's way more beautiful to look out your back door and see blooming flowers and mangroves and wildlife that's using your shoreline. And then a big one for homeowners is going to be the cost effectiveness. So it's going to be way cheaper and easier to maintain a living shoreline than to worry about your entire property falling in due to a collapsing seawall. So what time is it? So it's 12:45. I did have a video that I made that I was going to share that had some really cool pictures, but I think it's on our Facebook anyways. It's also on our YouTube channel, so I'm not going to play it. I am going to close by inviting you all to email me with any, if you are interested in engaging in any of these projects that I talked about, whether it's redemption of your seawall, let's improve it, how can we improve it, converting if you have a failing seawall, if you're interested in converting, or if you have a natural property line and you're looking to enhance it. I welcome you to reach out to me, send me pictures of your shoreline. I'd be happy to work with you. And yeah, so I think that's it. I'm going to look at the Q&A. So again, as a reminder, for those of you that weren't here in the beginning, I asked that you do not use the chat function. So at this point, if you have put anything in the chat function that you want to ask me, please put it on the Q&A, because it's really easy to answer the questions on Q&A. I can like actually go through them, whereas the chat function is a little hectic. Okay, so I have 3 comments that the video is not working. I'm sorry about that. I really thought it was going to work, but it didn't. And I think it's worth a watch to see that there are communities out there that are converting. This isn't just me being, you know, being green and wanting everyone to have a wildlife shoreline. You know, this is a movement. This is, you know, there's municipalities and state and local governments and national leadership that's saying that this is this can be a really great method depending on your shoreline and depending on your property. So go on YouTube, Google it. I think it's Living Shoreline, Seawall, Safety Harbor. So that's how you can watch that video. I recommend it. Would you be willing to help me analyze how to develop a plan to install a living shoreline on Max Brewer Causeway? That's also a great horseshoe breeding area. I want to propose to Brevard County. Bill, yes, let's do it. Like I said, you have my email here. We could talk about it. Definitely always interested. Rhonda, why did you use rocks for your breakwater as opposed to oyster reef? Great question. So the breakwater that we installed probably provides more protection than if we put in an oyster reef that's lower profile. The lower profile probably honestly at our shoreline would have been sufficient. We have a really like gentle slope that goes out for a really long time. So putting an oyster reef there probably would have been a really viable option. And I would like to do that, but I didn't want to put plastic out. So we went with rocks, which have recruited oysters. And like I said, we have more sections permitted that we can play with. So Rhonda and I have actually already talked about developing a monitoring protocol to put out some of those oyster prisms that I talked about from Cedar Key. So it could very well be that our next breakwater is actually an oyster prism breakwater rather than a coquina boulder breakwater. So good question. That's to be developed with your help. How do you determine how far to place a breakwater from the beach? Another good question. So it's actually the permitting agents that determine this. They have some really strict rules about how far you can place the structure from mean high water. So you have to get a survey done of your property to determine where mean high water is, and then the external toe, or the furthest point out from, you know, out on your breakwater structure, cannot exceed 10 feet from mean high water. However, I'm going through a literature review right now to make the argument that in certain cases we should be able to go further out. Some people have been able to go out to 30 feet. And the state has basically told me that if I can make a good argument and a justification for the 30 feet, they might consider it. So for that community up in Titusville that I'm currently working on the permitting for, I am going to do my best to try to get some of the breakwater structures pushed out to 30 feet, because everything that I've read basically says that they should be further out, and that allows for greater shoreline protection and erosion control. Are there currently grant programs available to homeowners wishing to add reef balls to their current seawalls? Another great question, and I really wish I could say yes. I am always looking for this, because this is a really top question that I get all the time, is that homeowners are like, I really want to convert my shoreline, but I don't want to pay for it. And are there grants to do that? And really the answer is not really, unfortunately. I'm always keeping an eye out for those grants. I would like to pursue a grant that allows, some community development in that area. There are I think that there's some private installations that have been done through the Save Our Lagoon project plan. Don't quote me on that, I'm not sure, but I think that there's been some shorelines that have been approved that are private. So if you would like a mangrove planting and you can wait until next year, we can probably put in a Save Our Lagoon project plan for mangrove plantings, but as far as reef balls go, I don't know. I would like to get to the point at MRC where we are building these reef balls and building those living seawall shapes that I showed you a picture of, to be able to sell at cost to homeowners, to really keep the cost down, to make it affordable. But more on that later. We don't really have a program up and running right now for that. So next question, what is the actual cost differential between conventional bulkhead seawalls and living shorelines? Another great question, and I actually debated on putting a slide in here about the numbers. In my original PowerPoint, I did have one, but I realized that it is actually much more complex to answer that question than I would like to chew. So basically it's highly dependent on the shoreline. But I just saw so many different numbers. So there were some sites that claimed that seawalls were $1,000 to $5,000 per linear foot for installation. And then I saw some figures for living shorelines that was like $10 to $50 per linear foot of installation. But of course, that's only like the raw materials. That's not like labor or permitting or any of that. So I kind of got bogged down in that question from myself, but it is undeniable that living shorelines are much more cost effective in terms of installation, repair, and maintenance. Living shorelines are definitely superior to seawalls and bulkheads and conventional ones. So I would say that as far as saving money, it's hard to nail down an exact figure, but if you Google that question, you will find a lot of different numbers. And all of them will reiterate that living shorelines are much more cost effective. If you want to install reef balls outside your seawall, what is the process and what is the cost of installing them? So again, this is something that is, I think reef balls have been deployed adjacent to seawalls. I have not done them yet, but I would like to. We have the molds at MRC. So this is something that in the next year or so, I would like to bring to our community as something that we offer. The process would be, we would have to file for a permit exemption, depending on your property and your navigational concerns in your canal. Hopefully the homeowner would qualify for an exemption or a de minimis permit that basically says there's no negative implications for this, there's no navigational concerns, just let us do this because it's gonna, improve water quality and habitat, and it's gonna prevent my seawall from falling. So I can't answer the cost. I hope to have this as something that we can offer, and as a nonprofit, of course, we try to keep our costs, you know, as low as possible to be able to share our services with the public. So more on that later, and I encourage you to take my email down and follow up with me on that because it's a good question. Have hemp bags been tried for oyster bags yet? I don't know about hemp in particular, but the fiber bags that we deployed were called cellulose. So they were some kind of plant-based natural fiber that was used. And I just realized I probably should like talk to you guys, like, hi, I'm here. So you can see me again. So the hemp bags, I don't know about hemp in particular, but I do know that the natural fiber bags have been used, and I suspect that hemp would probably break down about as quickly as those cellulose bags that we put out, and they literally lasted 17 days, and the shells, like, so this bag was full of shells, we put them out, and within 17 days, the shells were just scattered everywhere, and the bag was nowhere to be found. Do you know if the living shoreline approach is being utilized for the Cocoa Village Basin Restoration Project? To be honest, I have no idea. I don't know who is doing that project. I probably should know, and I don't, so I'm not sure. I'm sorry, I can't answer that question. Are there any friendly living reef for deeper water greater than 5 feet? Seawalls used in the lagoon canals. Okay, so the question is, if your seawall, you know, if the water adjacent to your seawall is greater than 5 feet in a canal, what can you do? It's a good question. I do know that the reef balls, one of the things that's cool about them is that there's like several different types of molds. So you can make some that are bigger. You know, they're going to be harder to deploy. You know, the smaller you go, the easier they are to move. You know, maybe 2 people can move it, whereas the bigger ones are probably going to be more difficult to move. So reef balls might be an option. I saw somebody that recently tried to plant mangroves in a canal, and they're using like cinder blocks at the bottom to like be able to plant the mangroves in them. So I don't know. This is a good question, and you know, developing methods for seawalls is something I would really like to do, because in reality, most people have a seawall. So to be able to figure out friendly methods to enhance those seawalls and protect them and keep them from falling and eroding, because that's the problem with them, and also improve water quality and habitat is really great. But they are difficult to work with because, you know, that dynamic, the hydrodynamics video that I showed you, where it just like creates this really turbulent, you know, environment, it just really makes it hard to get anything to go there. Are you familiar with the Living Shoreline project at the Whitney done with SOX Erosion Solutions Living Shoreline? At the Whitney, I'm assuming at the Whitney means like the Whitney lab in UF, that's where we got the core modules. So no, I'm not familiar. I know that the Whitney lab's doing a lot of aquaculture and clam stuff. I don't know what the SOX erosion solutions are, but I would love to know more. I'm always trying to learn more about different living shoreline solutions. So Ryan, feel free to reach out to me if you're, you know, if you want to talk about that. Is a coquina seawall considered a living seawall if portions are covered by a dock? So coquina seawall is considered a living seawall. I would say no, but I'm not really sure I understand the question. If it's a seawall, it's like it's inherently not living because of all the issues that we've talked about. And it being in the shade, I'm not sure if that's really gonna change, or if it's covered by a dock. I mean, there are things with the dock that you can do that will enhance it, like the Living Docks program from FIT that I was talking about. So just because it's a seawall or just because it's a dock doesn't necessarily mean you can't do things to make them more friendly. but yeah, I wouldn't really call it a living seawall unless you do those things. Like if you do those things and you hang if you're an oyster gardener, or if you put living seawall shapes on there to increase habitat, or if you do something kind of proactive to improve the benefits of that seawall or the functions of that seawall, then maybe you could call it a living seawall, but just because it's covered by a dock or it's in the shade doesn't make it living. Jute was the natural fiber for the prisms. Yes, the oyster prisms were made out of jute and then coated in cement, and they were really cool. So I got to go, thank you to MRC for sending me on a Florida Master Naturalist coastal restoration class to Cedar Key, and I learned hands-on how to make these oyster prisms, and I'm really excited to bring them here, and I really hope for them to be as efficient and successful as I suspect them to be. All right, couple more questions. Got to wrap it up. In the mangroves south of 520 and Cocoa Beach have just had many PVC 6-foot poles around some mangroves. What might they be for? So I was talking about that it's difficult to get plants to grow in this really turbulent, aqueous world on the shoreline. The PVC method used to be used in the restoration world. From my understanding, it's previous to my experience. We've never done them because everything that I've heard is that they don't necessarily improve success rates. And basically what you wind up with is just a PVC pole sticking out of the water. So I've never used them. I know that that's kind of like, at least from my understanding, it's like an antiquated kind of old method that's kind of been proved that it doesn't really have many benefits. In fact, it might just be costly because you wind up with plastic PVC, in the substrate. So that would be what they were intended for, is to improve success rates, but kind of debunked. Does the county give property tax credits for installing living shorelines on private property? No, but they should. Let's get on that. That would be another really great incentive. I think that, all the incentives for living shorelines, in my opinion, are like self-explanatory and they sell themselves. But if we could, provide tax credits and like substantial incentives for people to do this, because it also has a community impact by improving the health of our lagoon, I think that would be awesome. I don't know that that's going to happen, but if I were able to, I would make that happen. I would just wave my magic wand. So I guess does anybody have any more questions? It looks like there's more. Okay. Who was the restoration engineer who assisted you with your breakwater project? If you can say, if not, I'll email you. I will say he was an engineer for Palm Beach County. I won't share his name, but if you want to email me, I'd be happy to talk to you directly about that. Caity, this was very informative, great work with very promising potential. Keep experimenting, and thank you. Thank you. And I appreciate everybody listening. I was genuinely excited to share with you today. I feel like I've learned a lot about the living shoreline world. And one of the most exciting parts about it is that I feel like it's not fixed. It's not a fixed world of restoration that I work in. It's constantly evolving and changing, and we're always learning new things. But one thing that I would like the community to learn is that the status quo of how we used to develop doesn't have to be how we continue to develop. And I think that seawalls are really difficult to get permitted now because we've learned that they're harmful and they don't protect our shorelines like we thought they did. They might have a good purpose in some cases, but in a lot of cases where you have enough land to work with, having a wetland buffer is what is going to protect your shoreline and give you the most adaptability, as well as helping the community through improved water quality and wildlife habitat. So thank you everybody for listening. Hopefully you got my email, you know how to reach me. So Nicole told me how to start this thing, but not how to end it. So I think I'm gonna just stop recording first step. Stop sharing. All right. Bye, everybody. Have a good day. Thanks for listening.